Fire can burn branches and leaves, but it can never touch the deep roots anchored firmly in the earth. The truth about people is exactly the same. The wind howling through the Appalachian foothills of Blackwood County carried a bitter chill that night. It was late November. The temperature had plummeted to a brutal 17 degrees Fahrenheit. Heavy, wet snowflakes fell from a pitch-black sky, blanketing the long driveway of the only home Eleanor Vance had known for 35 years. She stood on the front porch, the worn leather handle of a single suitcase dug into her palm. Her thin wool coat offered little protection against the biting wind, but she did not shiver, she did not cry. Behind her, the heavy oak door shut with a dull, final thud. The deadbolt clicked into place. It was a small, sharp sound, yet it severed 3.5 decades of love, sacrifice, and grueling physical labor in a fraction of a second. Eleanor turned her head slightly, looking back at the frosted glass window of the door. Through the distorted pane, she could see the blurred silhouettes of Marcus and Sylvia. They were laughing. Eleanor was 74 years old. Her face, though lined with the deep grooves of time and exhaustion, held a quiet, unshakable dignity. Her hands were not the soft, manicured hands of a wealthy widow. They were rough, they were calloused, they were stained with the permanent marks of endless scrubbing, lifting, and comforting. For 35 years, those hands had been the only lifeline for her late husband, Arthur. A massive stroke had stolen Arthur's mobility shortly after their wedding. While other women her age were building careers, taking weekend trips, and enjoying the vibrant summer of their youth, Eleanor had willingly stepped into a quiet life of relentless duty. She had ground his pills into fine powder. She had spoon-fed him warm broth day after day, year after year. She had bathed him, turned him in the middle of the night to prevent bed sores, and read to him until her voice grew completely hoarse. She had loved him unconditionally, and in return, she was left with absolutely nothing. The betrayal had not come from Arthur, but from a fatal oversight, a forgotten 40-year-old will drafted long before Eleanor had ever entered his life. It was a dusty legal document that Arthur had simply forgotten to update in his diminished physical state. His children from his first marriage had never forgotten it. Marcus, now 50 years old, and his younger sister, Sylvia, 47, had spent the last 3 decades living lavishly in a distant city. They had never once visited to help change their father's soiled sheets. They had never once offered to sit by his bedside so Eleanor could sleep for a few consecutive hours. They only arrived when the heart monitor finally flatlined. They arrived in luxury imported sedans, trailing an army of ruthless corporate lawyers dressed in sharp, tailored suits. The legal ambush had been swift and brutal. The loophole in the archaic document was completely airtight. Because the estate, the sprawling acres, and the bank accounts were tied up in an ironclad trust established during Arthur's first marriage, the legal system blindly recognized Marcus and Sylvia as the sole beneficiaries. The state laws of West Virginia provided no safety net for a second spouse under these highly specific conditions. Eleanor had sat in the suffocating warmth of the lawyer's downtown office just 2 days ago, listening to the legal jargon meticulously strip away her entire existence. "It is just a matter of business, Eleanor," Marcus had said, adjusting the solid gold cufflink on his crisp white shirt. His voice was smooth, hollow, and utterly devoid of human empathy. "We truly appreciate your service to our father," Sylvia had added, offering a smile so thin and fragile it looked as though it might shatter into pieces. "But this house has always rightfully belonged to our side of the family. We need to prepare it for the real estate market immediately. The carrying costs are simply too high." They had given her 48 hours to pack her personal belongings, nothing of value, no antique furniture, not even the silverware she had polished for decades. Just the simple, worn clothes she had bought with her own meager grocery savings. Eleanor had not argued. She had not begged them for a tiny corner to sleep in, nor had she screamed about the agonizing injustice of it all. She knew that pleading with people who measured human worth in square feet and offshore bank accounts was a complete waste of breath. Silence was her only shield. Now, standing on the snow-covered porch, she took a slow, deep breath of the freezing mountain air. The cold burned her lungs, but it instantly cleared her mind. She pulled her faded wool scarf around her neck, her calloused fingers moving with deliberate slowness. She walked down the wooden steps. Each footfall was completely silent against the accumulating snow. She did not look back again. The driveway stretched for a quarter of a mile, a long ribbon of white winding through the dark skeletal oak trees. Eleanor walked the entire distance, her heavy winter boots sinking 2 inches deep into the fresh snow with each agonizing step. The wind whipped her gray hair across her wrinkled face, but her posture remained perfectly straight. She reached the end of the gravel road where her car was parked. It was a rusted Ford Taurus, nearly older than the bitter grudges of her stepchildren. The heavy metal door groaned in loud protest as she pulled it open and set her solitary suitcase on the torn passenger seat. She sat behind the steering wheel. The engine choked, sputtered violently, and finally roared to life, blowing a thick cloud of dark exhaust into the pristine white night. The broken heater barely worked, blowing lukewarm air against her numb, freezing fingers. She shifted the heavy transmission into gear. Stripped of everything at 74, Eleanor drove out into the dark night, completely unaware that a desolate pile of ashes was about to change her destiny forever. The worn heater of the 1998 Ford Taurus finally surrendered at exactly 3 in the morning. Eleanor awoke shivering violently. Her joints ached with the deep, penetrating cold that only a West Virginia winter could produce. She sat up slowly, her stiff fingers rubbing her numb cheeks. The windows were entirely frosted over from the inside, trapping her in a tiny, freezing steel cage. She was completely alone. As dawn broke, painting the snow-covered mountains in faint shades of gray, she began to empty her pockets. She pulled out crumpled bills, digging deep into the torn lining of her old purse for stray coins and checking the dirty floorboards for anything she might have dropped. She laid them out meticulously on the cracked vinyl dashboard, flattening the wrinkled paper with her calloused thumbs. She counted the quarters, the dimes, the heavily worn pennies. $82.50. That was the precise sum of her existence. After 35 years of back-breaking labor, countless sleepless nights, endless devotion to a dying man, and surrendering her entire youth to the confines of a sick room, society had reduced her value to a handful of dirty paper and copper. She did not weep. She simply gathered the money, wrapped it carefully in a thick rubber band, and put it back into her pocket. She started the dying engine and drove 3 miles into the center of town. The Blackwood County Courthouse was a massive, imposing structure made of gray stone and heavy mahogany doors. Eleanor did not go there for justice. She went there for the radiators. The heavy iron pipes hissed warmly in the back hallways, offering a free refuge for the freezing, the homeless, and the entirely desperate. She sat on a hard wooden bench, resting her tired legs. Across the hall, a bored county clerk was pinning public notices to a large corkboard. It was the annual delinquent property tax auction. Parcels of useless, abandoned land were being liquidated to clear the county ledgers. Eleanor stood up, walking slowly toward the board. Her eyes scanned the endless lists of barren acreage, condemned trailers, and worthless swamps until they stopped on a specific entry. Lot 404. The property description was bleak,
It listed 2 acres of unzoned land holding the ruins of the old Ashdown Academy. It had been a private library, entirely consumed by a massive fire 40 years ago. The county had long ago condemned the structure, and it had sat untouched, rotting beneath decades of overgrown weeds, broken glass, and black ash. The opening bid to clear the tax lien was laughably low, $13. Eleanor walked directly to the clerk's window. She pulled the rubber band off her meager roll of cash. She carefully peeled off a $10 bill and 3 singles, sliding them beneath the thick glass partition. "I want to purchase lot 404, she stated calmly. The clerk looked at her, entirely bewildered by the strange request from a frail, elderly woman, but he quickly began stamping the heavy stacks of legal paperwork anyway. As she waited, a harsh, familiar laugh echoed down the marble hallway. Eleanor did not flinch, though she recognized the sound instantly. Marcus and Sylvia were walking out of the probate judge's office, clutching thick manila folders filled with the legal transfer of Arthur's massive estate. They looked immaculate, wealthy, and completely victorious. Sylvia spotted Eleanor standing by the tax window and abruptly elbowed her brother. They walked over, their expensive Italian leather shoes clicking sharply against the polished stone floor. "Well, look who it is," Marcus sneered coldly, glancing down at the cheap auction paperwork resting on the counter. He leaned in, reading the bold black letters on the deed. He burst into a loud, mocking laugh. "A burned-down library?" Sylvia gasped mockingly, shaking her head in theatrical disbelief. "You are spending your last few dollars on a pile of charred garbage? Have you finally lost your mind, you crazy old woman? You're buying an ash urn graveyard." "It is fitting, really," Marcus added ruthlessly. "Garbage collecting garbage." Eleanor looked at them. She looked at their tailored suits, their cruel smiles, and the profound emptiness hiding just behind their eyes. She felt a brief flash of deep pity for them. They had inherited millions of dollars in real estate, yet they were completely bankrupt in the soul. She turned back to the clerk. She picked up the cheap plastic pen and signed her name on the heavy dotted line with absolute precision. She took the stamped deed, folded it neatly, and placed it into her deep coat pocket. She walked right past her stepchildren without uttering a single syllable, leaving their cruel laughter hanging uselessly in the cold air. Holding the certificate of ownership for a $13 plot of dirt, Eleanor drove her rusted car toward the desolate ruins, completely unaware that a century-old secret was patiently waiting to be awakened.
The rusted tires of the 1998 Ford Taurus crushed the frozen, overgrown weeds of a forgotten dirt road. Eleanor parked the dying vehicle at the edge of Lot 404. She stepped out into the biting wind. The property sat on a slight elevation, overlooking a desolate valley wrapped in thick winter fog. Before her stood the remnants of the old Ashdown Academy. It was a monument to absolute destruction. The roof had completely collapsed 40 years ago, sending thousands of pounds of heavy slate and timber crashing into the basement below. Blackened wooden beams clawed at the gray sky like the broken ribs of a massive, decaying beast. Thick vines of invasive ivy, dead and brittle from the freezing temperatures, strangled the remaining stone walls. The ground was a treacherous ocean of shattered glass, rusted nails, and deep layers of compacted black ash. Anyone else would have wept. Eleanor simply opened her trunk. She pulled out a pair of thick canvas work gloves, a rusted crowbar, and a heavy iron sledgehammer with a splintered wooden handle. She had used these exact tools for decades to repair broken fences, fix heavy floorboards, and maintain a sprawling estate while her stepchildren were attending lavish cocktail parties in the city.
She carried the heavy tools effortlessly, her 74-year-old shoulders bearing the weight without a single complaint. She walked slowly into the belly of the ruined library. The stench of old smoke and wet rot hung heavily in the freezing air. To the untrained eye, to people like Marcus and Sylvia, who valued only polished marble and immediate luxury, this was a worthless garbage dump. But Eleanor possessed a different kind of vision. She possessed the quiet, penetrating gaze of a woman who had spent 35 years looking past the broken exterior of a dying man to find the enduring soul underneath. She knew how to look for the foundation. She stopped in the center of what used to be the grand foyer. She knelt directly into the freezing dirt. She used her gloved hands to violently scrape away decades of accumulated mud, frozen snow, and thick black soot. Her fingers dug deep into the hard earth. She cleared a patch of ground 2 feet wide. Beneath the filthy grime, she finally found it. It was solid, hand-cut Pennsylvania slate. The heavy stone tiles were perfectly level, completely undamaged by the intense heat of the massive fire, and locked tightly together with old-world masonry. The foundation of the building had not shifted a single inch in 4 decades. She stood up. She walked over to the towering structural columns that had once held up the second-floor balconies. They were massive, thick trunks of old-growth oak, completely charred black on the outside and seemingly destroyed by the flames. The bark looked like brittle charcoal. Eleanor raised the heavy iron hammer high above her shoulder. She swung it with all her remaining strength. The heavy iron head smashed brutally against the blackened column. A thick shower of black dust and brittle charcoal exploded into the air. But the column did not snap. It did not crumble into useless dust. Instead, the hammer bounced back violently, sending a sharp, painful vibration up her thin arms. She struck it again. She struck it a 3rd time. The brittle outer layer of burnt wood simply flaked away, revealing a core of dense, golden brown oak underneath. The intense fire had only charred the outer 2 inches of the massive beams, effectively sealing and petrifying the heartwood like solid iron. The bones were spectacular. The entire skeleton of the old library was completely intact, waiting patiently beneath the terrible scars of the fire for someone willing to put in the grueling physical labor to clean it. Eleanor ran her calloused hands over the exposed, rock-hard wood. She felt a profound sense of kinship with the broken building. They were both far stronger than they looked. She thought of Marcus and Sylvia. She remembered their cruel laughter echoing in the warm, polished marble halls of the county courthouse. They called this place an ash urn graveyard. They believed wealth was something handed to you on a silver platter, neatly typed onto a legal document by expensive attorneys. They could never understand the immense, quiet power of salvaging something that the rest of the world had completely thrown away. Eleanor wiped a streak of black soot from her wrinkled forehead. She continued her meticulous inspection. She walked the perimeter, noting the thickness of the stone walls. They were 18 inches of solid granite, built to withstand the brutal mountain winters. She examined the massive hinges still bolted to the stone archways. They were heavily rusted, covered in bright orange flakes, but they were still securely anchored deep into the rock. She calculated the grueling labor required. It would take thousands of hours. It would require dragging away hundreds of pounds of debris by hand, sorting through endless piles of ash, and fighting the bitter cold every single day. Her hands would bleed. Her back would scream in agony. She welcomed the pain. Physical labor was honest. It did not lie. It did not manipulate the law, and it did not betray you in the middle of the night. She moved steadily toward the far eastern corner of the ruins. This area had suffered the worst of the collapse. It was buried under 3 feet of heavy debris, twisted metal, and shattered bricks. Eleanor began to clear the rubble, tossing aside heavy chunks of plaster and broken stone with a quiet, relentless rhythm. She needed to find the edge of the perimeter wall. She raised her heavy hammer to break apart a large, stubborn slab of melted concrete that was blocking her path. She brought the iron down hard against the frozen stone. A strange sound echoed through the freezing air. It was not the dull, flat thud of solid ground. It was a deep, resonant boom. Eleanor froze. She lowered the hammer slowly. She tightened her grip on the splintered wooden handle and stared down at the cracked stone beneath her boots. She tapped the stone again, gently this time. The vibration traveled deep into the earth, returning with a hollow, echoing resonance. But when Eleanor swung the hammer and shattered the cracked stone in the corner of the old reading room, a strange, hollow sound echoed up from beneath the floorboards, suggesting this place held more than just a single level.
The morning after discovering the hollow echo beneath the cracked slate floor, the temperature plummeted to a brutal 14 degrees Fahrenheit. A vicious northern wind howled through the skeletal remains of the old library, carrying tiny shards of ice that stung exposed skin like flying glass. Most people would have surrendered to the bitter cold. Most people would have retreated to a warm fireplace, cursing their terrible luck and mourning their lost fortunes. Eleanor did not retreat. She woke up in the back seat of her rusted 1998 Ford Taurus, her breath forming thick white clouds in the freezing air of the cabin. Her joints screamed in absolute agony. Her spine throbbed from broken springs, and her frail fingers were completely stiff from the biting cold. She slowly flexed her hands. She reached into her thin canvas bag, pulled out an old cotton bedsheet, and methodically tore it into long, narrow strips. She wrapped the makeshift bandages tightly around her palms and knuckles, creating a thick layer of protection against the brutal friction of the heavy tools. She tied the knots securely with her teeth. She was ready. For the next 14 days, the 74-year-old widow subjected herself to a level of grueling physical labor that would have broken men half her age. Her daily routine was entirely merciless. She began at dawn, long before the pale winter sun crept over the jagged peaks of the Appalachian Mountains. Armed with nothing but a rusted iron shovel and a cracked wooden wheelbarrow she had found abandoned in a nearby ditch, Eleanor began to meticulously clear the dense layers of ruin. She shoveled hundreds of pounds of compacted black ash. She hauled twisted sheets of heavy corrugated tin, dragging them inch by inch across the frozen dirt until her muscles burned with an intense, consuming fire. The wet soot coated her worn clothes, turning her face and hands entirely black until she looked like a shadow moving silently through the wreckage. She did not stop. Whenever the pain in her lower back became too blinding to ignore, she would simply stand up straight, close her eyes, and take a long, deep breath of the freezing mountain air. She thought of Marcus and Sylvia. At that exact moment, 50 miles away in the bustling city center, her stepchildren were undoubtedly sitting in plush leather chairs inside a climate-controlled high-rise office. They were probably drinking imported sparkling water and signing heavily tailored legal documents that possessed absolutely zero physical weight. They were moving millions of dollars with the effortless flick of an expensive fountain pen. They were completely clean. They were utterly hollow. Eleanor opened her eyes, gripping the splintered wooden handle of her shovel even tighter, and plunged the heavy iron blade back into the freezing dirt. Physical labor was a powerful, quiet medicine.
It demanded absolute presence. It left no room for self-pity, no space for useless tears, and no energy for screaming at the profound unfairness of the universe. With every 80 pounds of rubble she hauled away, she felt she was physically shedding the heavy burdens of her past. She was not just clearing a ruined building, she was excavating her own soul. By the beginning of the third week, the massive piles of debris outside the perimeter wall had grown to over 6 feet tall. She was currently battling a massive section of collapsed roofing. 3 enormous oak beams, each weighing nearly 400 pounds, lay tangled together over the eastern corner of the main reading room, the exact spot where she had heard the hollow echo. She wedged her heavy iron bar beneath the thickest beam, pushing her entire body weight against the cold metal, desperately trying to create leverage. The massive timber did not move a single inch. She wiped a mixture of freezing sweat and black soot from her forehead, her chest heaving with deep, ragged breaths. "You need a fulcrum for that." The deep, gravelly voice broke the absolute silence of the ruins. Eleanor turned around slowly, her hands still gripping the heavy iron bar. Standing 10 yards away, near the jagged entrance of the destroyed foyer, was a man. He looked to be about 68 years old, broad-shouldered and deeply weathered. He wore a faded red flannel coat, heavily stained denim jeans, and thick leather boots completely caked in dried yellow mud. His gray beard was wild, but his eyes were sharp, observant, and entirely calm. It was Silas Thorne. He was a retired union carpenter and former logger who lived in a small wooden cabin just 1 mile down the winding dirt road. For the past 3 weeks, he had driven his rusted Chevrolet truck past Lot 404, watching in quiet disbelief as a frail, elderly woman single-handedly tore apart a mountain of frozen ruins. He had expected her to give up after the first day. When she did not, he had expected her to freeze to death during the bitter winter nights. But every single morning, as he drove past the property, he saw the small, dark figure methodically swinging a hammer, hauling heavy debris, and refusing to surrender to the mountain. He walked slowly toward her. He did not offer a patronizing smile. He did not ask her if she was lost or if she needed to call a relative. A man who had spent his entire life working with his hands recognized the sacred, unbreakable dignity of someone engaged in honest, brutal labor. He simply reached into the deep pocket of his coat and pulled out a heavy steel thermos. He unscrewed the metal cap, poured a steaming cup of dark black coffee, and held it toward her. "Drink this," he murmured quietly, his tone conveying a deep, unquestioning respect. Eleanor looked at the steaming metal cup. She looked up at his weathered face. "Thank you," she replied softly, her voice raspy from days of silence. She took the cup. The intense heat radiating through the steel sent a sudden shock of warmth into her numb, bleeding fingers. She drank the liquid slowly, letting the incredible warmth travel down her throat and settle into her shivering chest. Silas did not wait for her to finish. He turned around, walking back to his rusted truck parked on the gravel shoulder. He lowered the heavy steel tailgate with a loud clatter. He pulled out a massive iron pry bar, 3 thick blocks of scrap pine, and a heavy chain hoist designed for lifting massive tree trunks. He carried the heavy equipment back into the ruins. He walked directly to the massive oak beam that had defeated Eleanor just moments before. He placed the thick blocks of pine on the solid slate floor, wedged his heavy iron bar perfectly beneath the timber, and looked over his shoulder. "If we pull together on the count of 3, we can roll this monster right over the wall." Eleanor handed him the empty metal cup. She walked over to the timber. She placed her bandaged hands right beside his thick, calloused fingers. They did not exchange names. They did not discuss the legal tragedy that had brought her there, nor did they talk about the quiet solitude of his retirement. Those things were completely irrelevant in the face of the massive physical task before them. 1. Silas counted slowly. 2, 3. They threw their combined weight backward with brutal force.
The thick iron bar groaned loudly against the heavy wood. The massive oak timber creaked, shifted, and finally rolled forward with a deafening crash, tumbling heavily over the stone perimeter wall and landing in the snow-filled trench outside. It was the beginning of an extraordinary silent partnership. For the next 12 days, Silas arrived at the ruins every morning at exactly 6 o'clock. He brought hot coffee, extra pairs of heavy canvas gloves, and an arsenal of professional logging tools. They worked side by side in the freezing temperatures, speaking only when absolutely necessary to coordinate the movement of dangerous, heavy materials. They rigged complicated pulley systems using the surviving stone archways. They hoisted massive iron radiators out of the deep ash. They hauled away over 2 tons of destroyed roofing, shattered glass, and twisted copper pipes. Under the combined force of their relentless labor, the chaotic mountain of garbage slowly began to transform. The magnificent, enduring skeleton of the Ashdown Academy finally emerged completely from its dark tomb. The massive stone walls stood proud and clean. The heavy slate floor was swept entirely free of soot. On the afternoon of the 15th day together, the pale winter sun finally broke through the heavy gray clouds, casting a bright golden light across the newly cleared ruins. Eleanor and Silas were standing in the far eastern corner of the main reading room. This was the exact spot where Eleanor had struck the floor with her hammer weeks ago. They had spent the entire morning clearing 3 feet of frozen, compacted mud and shattered bricks from this specific area. Beneath the heavy rubble, they had uncovered something highly unusual. Unlike the rest of the building, which was paved in uniform squares of gray slate, this specific corner was covered by massive, incredibly thick planks of old-growth mahogany. The wood was completely unburned, having been deeply buried and starved of oxygen during the massive fire 40 decades ago. The heavy planks were perfectly flush with the surrounding stone, fitted together with the meticulous precision of a master shipbuilder. Eleanor knelt on the cold stone. She ran her bandaged fingers along the impossibly tight seams. There were no iron nails visible. There were no rusted screws. The wood was locked into place by hidden joints, designed to look exactly like an ordinary seamless decorative border. Silas knelt beside her. He ran his calloused thumb over the dark wood, his eyes narrowing in intense concentration. He recognized the extraordinary craftsmanship immediately. "This is not a floor," Silas muttered slowly, his deep voice barely rising above a whisper. "This is a structural cap." He reached for his heaviest iron crowbar. He wedged the sharp, flattened tip of the heavy iron tool into a microscopic gap between the thick mahogany wood and the solid gray stone. He gripped the cold metal shaft with both hands, planting his heavy boots firmly on the ground. He pushed downward with immense, deliberate force. The ancient wood groaned loudly in protest. A sharp, violent cracking sound echoed through the freezing air as decades of dried mud and petrified dust finally gave way under the immense pressure. The heavy mahogany board began to lift. Silas pushed harder, throwing his heavy shoulders into the iron bar to pry the thick mahogany completely out of its ancient frame. But suddenly, the intense resistance vanished entirely. The thick mahogany board snapped upward with terrifying speed. The heavy iron crowbar slipped wildly from Silas's grip, tumbling forward into the dark, gaping hole that had just been exposed beneath the floorboards, falling violently into an endless void below. The heavy iron crowbar vanished into the absolute darkness. Eleanor and Silas froze. They listened intently, standing completely motionless in the freezing wind, waiting for the harsh, metallic clang of the tools striking the deep earth. 1 second passed, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. A dull, distant thud finally echoed upward. It was incredibly deep. It was far deeper than a standard shallow crawl space. Silas did not hesitate. He grabbed his heavy iron sledgehammer and began violently smashing the remaining mahogany planks. He ripped the shattered wood away with his thick hands, tossing the expensive timber aside like cheap kindling. Eleanor knelt beside him, using her bare, calloused hands to claw away the decades of compacted ash and dried mud that packed the hidden seams. Within 20 minutes, the entire perimeter was completely exposed. It was not a dirt hole. Buried beneath 3 feet of ruined slate lay a massive, solid cast steel trapdoor. It was entirely black, heavy enough to rival a major bank vault, and perfectly set into a thick concrete frame. Running along the outer edge of the heavy steel was a thick, pale white gasket. It was early industrial asbestos. The brilliant, terrified architect of the Ashdown Academy had deliberately installed a brutal, uncompromising fire seal. "This door weighs at least 600 pounds, Silas muttered grimly, wiping a thick layer of freezing sweat from his eyes. "We cannot ever lift this by hand." "Then we build a hoist," Eleanor replied calmly. They worked relentlessly for 3 agonizing hours. Silas drove his rusted truck much closer to the perimeter wall. He unspooled 40 feet of heavy steel cable from the front winch, dragging the heavy iron hook through the freezing snow. They rigged a massive iron tripod directly over the steel trapdoor, wrapping thick logging chains tightly through the heavy rusted ring bolted to the center of the metal plate. Eleanor stood back. Silas engaged the heavy electric winch. The thick steel cable snapped totally taut, humming with terrifying tension. The heavy truck groaned loudly, its rear tires sliding backward 2 inches in the icy mud. The logging chain screamed under the immense pressure. For a long, agonizing moment, nothing happened. Then, a deafening crack shattered the absolute silence as the 40-year-old vacuum seal finally broke. The massive steel door slowly lifted upward, groaning loudly on its thick iron hinges, exposing a pitch-black square of absolute nothingness. A sudden rush of air blasted upward into their faces. It was not the foul, suffocating stench of rotting wood or standing water. It was incredibly dry, cold, and entirely stale. The original builder had installed deep subterranean ventilation shafts, drawing air from the valley floor miles away, ensuring the underground chamber remained perfectly devoid of destroying moisture. Silas retrieved 2 heavy brass flashlights from his truck. He handed one to Eleanor. He stepped down onto the first stone step. Eleanor followed right behind him. They descended exactly 24 solid granite steps into the belly of the dark earth. The temperature dropped significantly, but the heavy dampness of the West Virginia winter vanished completely. At the bottom of the long staircase, the bright yellow beams of their flashlights cut directly through the absolute darkness. The secret basement was enormous. It spanned over 400 square feet, carved directly into the dense mountain bedrock. The walls were lined with thick red brick, but the massive space was not empty. Sitting perfectly elevated on thick wooden pallets in the center of the room were 12 massive steamer trunks. They were entirely encased in dull gray zinc. The omniscient eye of history knew exactly how they got there. 40 years ago, on the sweltering July evening before a massive, destructive riot consumed the county and burned the Ashdown Academy to the ground, the frantic head librarian made a desperate, terrifying choice. He knew the angry mobs were coming with torches. He knew the police were completely overwhelmed. He did not try to save the modern fiction. He did not try to save the heavy oak furniture or the expensive oil paintings in the grand foyer. He took the absolute core of the collection, the irreplaceable beating heart of American history, and carried it down into the dark earth. He sealed the heavy vault, walked out into the roaring flames, and took the exact location of the hidden basement to his grave. The ignorant world believed the treasures had turned to ash. They had merely been sleeping. Silas approached the closest zinc trunk. The thick brass latches were slightly tarnished, but completely free of heavy rust. He snapped the heavy locks open with his strong thumbs.
He slowly lifted the heavy metal lid. Eleanor stepped forward, shining her bright flashlight directly into the interior. She did not gasp. She simply stared in profound, absolute silence. Inside the heavy trunk, meticulously wrapped in thick layers of dry oilcloth and protective wax paper, were hundreds of immaculate, perfectly preserved documents. There were thick leather-bound ledgers, immense stacks of fragile yellowed parchment, and heavy vellum scrolls securely bound with faded silk ribbons. Eleanor reached out with her bandaged, heavily scarred hands. She delicately peeled back a thick layer of crisped wax paper. Beneath the protective wrapping lay a single sheet of heavy, textured cotton paper. The ink was a dark, fading iron gall brown. It was a handwritten letter, completely pristine, holding the profound weight of centuries within its precise, elegant cursive strokes. She read the faded date at the top right corner, 1779. Her quiet eyes moved slowly down the fragile page, carefully scanning the meticulously drafted paragraphs discussing the urgent, terrifying philosophy of liberty and the heavy burden of forging a completely new nation out of bloody warfare. Then she reached the absolute bottom of the page. There, anchored securely beneath a formal closing, was a bold, sweeping signature that instantly commanded absolute reverence. When looking directly at the sharp, unmistakable handwriting on the yellowed parchment with Thomas Jefferson's signature, Eleanor knew this $13 ash pile held a secret that could easily shake the entire nation.
Silas Thorne did not own a cellular telephone. He drove his heavy, rusted truck exactly 1 mile down the dirt road to his small wooden cabin, picked up a heavy black rotary phone, and dialed a number he knew by heart. He called his 45-year-old nephew, Dr. Aris Thorne. Aris was the head of historical archives at a prominent state university located exactly 60 miles away. When Silas described the thick mahogany cap, the heavy asbestos seal, and the zinc-lined trunks, Aris dropped his coffee cup onto his polished office floor. He canceled his entire afternoon schedule immediately. He drove his clean silver sedan at 80 miles per hour through the winding mountain passes. When Aris arrived at Lot 404, the brutal winter wind had died down. The temperature hovered around 22 degrees Fahrenheit. He stepped out of his warm car, wearing an expensive wool overcoat and carrying a heavy metal briefcase. He walked into the ruined library. He saw his uncle and the 74-year-old widow standing quietly by the open steel trapdoor. Eleanor was covered entirely in black soot, her thin hands wrapped tightly in dirty, blood-stained cotton strips. Aris looked at her with profound respect. He descended the 24 solid granite steps. The air in the subterranean vault remained completely still. Aris opened his heavy metal briefcase with trembling hands. He pulled out a pair of pristine white cotton gloves, slipping them carefully over his clean fingers. He approached the open zinc trunk. He did not speak. He gently lifted the heavy wax paper. He stared directly at the iron gall ink on the 1779 document. He looked at the elegant signature of Thomas Jefferson. He stopped breathing. He slowly moved to the next trunk, unlocking the heavy brass latches. Inside, stacked in immaculate rows, were perfectly preserved handwritten drafts of novels from the 19th century. There were unedited chapters written by Herman Melville, intimate personal journals belonging to Edgar Allan Poe, and dozens of unpublished essays by Ralph Waldo Emerson. Aris took off his thick wire-rimmed glasses. He used his clean silk tie to wipe a heavy layer of cold sweat from his pale forehead. He looked at his uncle.
He looked at the stoic, elderly woman standing quietly in the shadows. "This is completely impossible," Aris whispered softly, his voice shaking violently with pure academic terror and absolute awe. "This collection was legally declared destroyed 40 years ago." "It survived," Eleanor stated calmly. "Ma'am," Aris stammered nervously, leaning heavily against the thick red brick wall to support his shaking legs. "You do not just have a few rare books, you possess the lost architectural blueprints of the American soul." He closed the heavy trunk gently. He looked directly into Eleanor's calm, tired eyes. "On the open international auction market, assuming full legal provenance and authenticated physical condition, the opening bid for this entire archival collection is staggering," he said breathlessly. He paused, taking a deep, ragged breath. $14,500,000. Silas dropped his heavy brass flashlight. The metal cylinder hit the solid stone floor with a loud, violent clang, rolling slowly into the dark corner. The hardened union carpenter stared at his nephew in absolute disbelief. Eleanor did not drop anything. She did not gasp, she did not scream with joy, and she did not faint. She simply stood in the quiet darkness of the underground vault, her spine perfectly straight. She thought of the exact $82.50 she had laid out on her cracked vinyl dashboard just weeks ago. She thought of the 35 years of agonizing physical labor she had freely given to a dying man. She nodded her head once. "Thank you, Doctor," she replied evenly. But secrets of this monumental magnitude simply cannot be contained beneath the earth for very long. Within 48 hours, anonymous whispers of a miraculous historical discovery began to leak rapidly through the tight academic circles of the state university, eventually bleeding into the mainstream press. News of the treasure beneath the ashes quickly appeared on the front pages of newspapers, and naturally, it instantly reached the ears of the exact ruthless people who had thrown Eleanor out into the winter night.
The sleek black Mercedes-Benz sedan crawled slowly up the frozen dirt road. Its heavy tires crushed the brittle winter weeds, stopping exactly 20 yards from the cleared perimeter wall of Lot 404. The ambient temperature was exactly 31 degrees Fahrenheit. The heavy car doors swung open with a soft, expensive click. Marcus and Sylvia stepped out into the biting wind. They were completely out of place in their tailored cashmere coats and perfectly polished Italian leather shoes. They stared at the massive, clean stone ruins, their eyes wide with a manic, desperate greed. They had seen the front page of the morning newspaper. They had seen the staggering $14,500,000 appraisal printed in bold, undeniable black ink. They walked briskly toward the center of the site. Eleanor stood quietly near the open trapdoor. She wore the exact same stained wool coat she had worn on the night of her brutal eviction. Her thin hands were wrapped tightly in the same filthy, blood-stained cotton strips. Silas stood exactly 3 feet behind her. He held a massive iron crowbar in his right hand, his weathered face completely unreadable. Standing to Eleanor's immediate right was a tall, sharp-featured man in a dark charcoal suit. He was the chief legal counsel for the state university, dispatched immediately to protect the newly discovered historical assets. Marcus forced a wide, completely unnatural smile. "Mother!" Marcus declared loudly, stretching out his arms in a grotesque display of fake affection. "We have been worried sick about you. You simply vanished into the night without a single trace." Eleanor did not move a single inch. She said absolutely nothing. "We saw the incredible news on the television," Sylvia added breathlessly. She stepped carefully over a pile of broken slate to keep her expensive boots entirely clean.
We came exactly as quickly as we could to help you manage this massive burden. We know you are not equipped to handle such a complicated, high-level financial situation." They stopped 10 feet away from the trapdoor. "We have spoken extensively to our legal team," Marcus continued smoothly, adjusting his thick silk tie. "They completely agree that since you used funds acquired during your marriage to our late father to purchase this property, the contents of that vault are legally part of his extended estate. We are prepared to be extremely generous today, Eleanor. We will settle for exactly 80% of the auction proceeds, and we will gracefully allow you to keep the remaining change." It was a breathtaking display of pure, unadulterated arrogance. They expected her to cower in fear. They expected the frail 74-year-old widow to instantly fold under the terrifying threat of endless corporate litigation and aggressive downtown lawyers. Eleanor looked at them with profound, quiet pity. She turned her head slightly toward the tall man in the charcoal suit. The university lawyer stepped forward. He did not smile. He reached into his thick leather briefcase and pulled out a crisp, heavy stack of official legal documents. "Mr. Vance," the lawyer stated coldly, his voice slicing through the freezing mountain wind like a razor blade. "My name is David Sterling. I represent the board of directors at the State University. Your claim is not only entirely factually incorrect, but it is also exceptionally dangerous to your personal freedom." Marcus dropped his fake smile immediately. "Excuse me?" Marcus snapped angrily. "Blackwood County tax auction laws are absolute," the lawyer explained meticulously. He held up a certified copy of the $13 deed. "When the county liquidates a condemned property to clear an abandoned tax lien, it completely severs all prior chains of title. Furthermore, you formally evicted this woman and legally severed her from your father's estate precisely 48 hours before she made this purchase. She bought this land as an entirely independent citizen, using exactly $82 of her own completely untethered cash." Sylvia's face turned completely pale. "You cannot prove that," Sylvia hissed venomously. "She obviously stole that money from our house before we threw her out." The lawyer adjusted his heavy wire-rimmed glasses. "Actually, we can prove absolutely everything," the lawyer replied evenly. "In order to establish the undisputed legal provenance of a $14 million historical archive, the university was strictly required to run a comprehensive, exhaustive financial audit on Mrs. Vance. We had to ensure no hidden creditors could ever claim these magnificent assets." He pulled a second, much thicker folder from his leather briefcase. It was heavily bound with a red rubber band and stamped with the bold blue seal of a federal banking investigator. "During that mandatory audit, we had to review the entire financial history of the Vance Family Trust over the last 35 years, the lawyer continued, his tone dropping to a dead, terrifying calm. "We found something highly disturbing, Mr. Vance." Marcus took a sudden, jerky step backward. His expensive leather shoe slipped slightly on the frozen dirt. "During the examination of the final 3 years of your late father's life, the federal investigators noticed massive, unexplained liquidations of his primary retirement accounts. Millions of dollars were quietly transferred into offshore holding companies located entirely outside of the United States. The authorization forms for these massive wire transfers were explicitly signed by your father." The lawyer paused, letting the bitter wind carry the heavy, suffocating silence. "Your father was entirely paralyzed from the neck down. He physically could not hold a pen for 35 years. Sylvia gasped loudly, covering her mouth with her trembling, perfectly manicured hand. "We forwarded these highly detailed findings to the federal prosecutor exactly 4 hours ago," the lawyer concluded sharply. "A federal judge has entirely dismissed your frivolous civil claim on this property. Furthermore, the authorities are currently drafting criminal warrants for massive wire fraud, elder financial abuse, and federal tax evasion. You are looking at a minimum of 20 years in a federal penitentiary." They were completely ruined.
The crushing weight of absolute karma descended upon them with terrifying, inescapable speed. The millions they had stolen, the cruel eviction they had orchestrated, and the arrogant laughter in the county courthouse had finally caught up to them in a single devastating moment. Marcus opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. His face was entirely flushed with absolute suffocating panic. He grabbed his younger sister roughly by the arm, spinning her around violently. They stumbled heavily over the broken bricks, nearly falling face first into the freezing mud in their desperate, pathetic rush to escape. They scrambled back into their sleek, black luxury car, like terrified rats fleeing a burning building. The heavy engine roared loudly. The tires spun wildly in the deep dirt, throwing thick chunks of frozen mud high into the air as they sped recklessly down the long mountain road, completely desperate to outrun a massive legal storm they had built entirely with their own hands. Eleanor watched them go. She did not cheer. She did not gloat. She simply stood in the quiet ruins of the old library, her heavily calloused hands resting calmly by her sides. The toxic, suffocating shadows of the past 35 years had finally been burned away entirely. Watching the cruel people who had discarded her flee in absolute humiliation, Eleanor slowly turned her back to the dirt road, fully prepared to step into the most radiant chapter of her entire existence.
Exactly 18 months later, the rugged landscape of Blackwood County transformed completely. The staggering $14,500,000 from the international auction did not go into a sterile offshore bank account. It went directly back into the freezing mountain earth. Eleanor Vance hired an army of master stonemasons, specialized historical architects, and local union carpenters. They worked relentlessly through 2 bitter winters and 1 sweltering summer to resurrect the magnificent ruins. The Ashdown Academy was reborn. It was now a state-of-the-art private museum open entirely to the public. The massive roof was rebuilt using thousands of heavy pounds of heavy slate, perfectly matching the original 19th century blueprints discovered deep inside the vault. The grand foyer was meticulously restored with thick, polished oak beams and warm brass fixtures that gleamed brilliantly in the afternoon sun. But Eleanor made one uncompromising, absolute demand during the massive reconstruction. The eastern wall remained completely untouched. It was a staggering 40-foot expanse of entirely blackened, charred granite. The deep scars from the fire 40 years ago were deliberately preserved, standing in stark, beautiful contrast to the pristine new construction surrounding it. It was a massive, silent monument to the enduring power of survival, a testament to roots that simply refused to burn. Exactly 200 yards away, nestled deeply beneath a canopy of ancient pine trees, sat a completely new structure. It was a small, incredibly sturdy cabin built from thick cedar logs. Silas Thorne had built the entire frame with his own calloused hands. The wide front porch faced the deep valley, catching the bright, warming rays of the early morning sun. The ambient temperature was a perfect, crisp 55 degrees Fahrenheit, carrying the sweet scent of blooming mountain laurel and fresh wood smoke. Eleanor sat quietly on a heavy wooden porch swing. She was 76 years old. She wore a simple, clean cotton dress and a thick woven shawl. Her deeply lined face was completely at peace. Her rough hands, resting in her lap, still bore the heavy, permanent white scars of the brutal winter excavation, but they no longer ached with cold or bled in the dark. They were the hands of a conqueror. The heavy wooden screen door creaked open smoothly. Silas walked out onto the porch, carrying 2 steaming ceramic mugs of dark black tea. He handed one to Eleanor, sitting down slowly on the opposite end of the wide swing.
He looked out over the massive 2-acre property, watching a small line of early visitors driving up the long gravel road toward the beautiful stone museum. "The university buses will arrive in an hour," Silas murmured softly, taking a slow sip from his warm cup. Eleanor watched the golden sunlight spill perfectly across the deep valley. "Let them come," she replied peacefully. She took a quiet sip of her hot tea. She did not think about Marcus and Sylvia, who were currently sitting in a cold federal courthouse miles away, entirely stripped of their stolen wealth and facing decades behind heavy iron bars, completely destroyed by their own bottomless greed. She did not dwell on the bitter, agonizing 35 years of her past. She only felt the profound, solid weight of the wooden swing beneath her and the incredible warmth of the rising sun on her face. The true wealth of a human being is never measured by archaic legal documents. It is not found in the hollow inheritance of stolen bank accounts or the cruel judgments of a broken society. It lies entirely in the quiet, unyielding ability to maintain absolute dignity when thrown violently into the deepest ashes. It is found in the hands that are never afraid to bleed, to drag the light back into the world.